What's up, everybody? Welcome back. We are here with some more NFL DFS picks and lineup advice for DraftKings and FanDuel. This time for the single game showdown slate on Thursday Night Football. It's Week 12, Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Cleveland Browns. Welcome. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, single game $1 million winner. In this video, we will talk about the injuries. There really aren't that many that impact tonight's slate. Talk about obviously some core plays and low risk lineup construction tips, but then it's that time of the year. We can finally talk about probably one of the biggest, most profitable strategies for showdown contests, and it applies to tonight's game. So stick around for that. Let's start with these injuries or these non existent injuries. Probably the cleanest showdown slate we've had maybe all season. No offensive players on the injury report that are impactful, no defensive players. Really, Cleveland lost one of their offensive tackles. What's new for the Cleveland Browns? But that is already impacted. It's already reflected in the spread and total for this game. So not something we need to add on extra into our projections. So these teams are pretty similar, honestly, in terms of knowing how they're going to deploy their players. There are some teams where we're not sure how wide receiver twos and threes, tight ends twos and threes, running backs even are going to be used. Not really the case. Both of these teams are relatively predictable in how they're going to deploy their offensive players. So if we just look really quickly, give you a quick rundown. Both teams are going to split backfields. If we start on Pittsburgh side, Najee Harris is basically the 1A to Jalen Warren's 1B, and maybe it's an A versus, or maybe it's a 1 versus 2 situation. Najee consistently getting more touches and carries than Jalen Warren. And in fact, in the red zone, Najee leads Jalen Warren 12-6 over the last 3 weeks. So Najee is certainly the guy here we want in Pittsburgh's backfield. On Cleveland's side, obviously Nick Chubb has recently returned, and they're using Jerome Ford, and Nick Chubb in a pretty predictable way. Nick Chubb getting most of the early down work, most of the rushing attempts for Cleveland, while Jerome Ford is running more routes. However, the most interesting thing is that Nick Chubb actually has all of the red zone opportunities for this backfield since he's returned. Jerome Ford has exactly 0 since Nick Chubb has returned here. So that is interesting, certainly for showdown purposes. Both teams have 3 primary wide receivers. They don't really use anyone else besides those 3 wide receivers. On Pittsburgh side, it's obviously George Pickens as the alpha, but then it's Van Jefferson, then it's Calvin Austin mixing in as well. And on Cleveland side, ever since Amari was traded, it's Jerry Jeudy, it's Elijah Moore, it's Cedric Tillman. Cedric Tillman being the 1B, and Cedric Tillman at 7K on DraftKings. Let's go here to the flex. As the wide receiver 1A, 1B, depending on the week, probably a little too cheap at 7K based on his role. And they both have primary tight ends. Njoku, primary pass catching tight end for Cleveland. Freiermuth, primary pass catching tight end for Pittsburgh. So pretty predictable. We don't have to do too much or think too much about how these teams are going to use their players. And if we look at knowing their usage, Ford is probably a little too cheap on DraftKings at $4,400 as the running back 1B, and then Calvin Austin as the wide receiver 3 for Pittsburgh is too cheap at $2,000, and we already mentioned Cedric Tillman at $7,000. Normally a wide receiver 1B would be $8,000 or more, so he's probably a little too cheap there. If we go over to FanDuel, let's see here. Pricing pretty typical. Tillman 10.5 is probably too cheap here. Ford at 8K, probably too cheap here as well. But those are really the biggest pricing mismatches and probably one of the better price showdown slates that we've had. Maybe because these teams are so predictable and there haven't been any injuries to offensive skill position players, so the sites can actually price them as they should be priced. So all that said, let's talk about low risk contests now. 50-50s, double ups, head to heads. But you know what? Actually, before we do that, let's talk about underperformers. Cleveland still has 2 underperforming wide receivers, despite having 2 a week ago and winning some GPPs with Jerry Jeudy and even Elijah Moore in some contests. Jerry Jeudy is off the underperforming wide receiver list. He had a big game last week. Elijah Moore remains on the list. We look at his game logs over the last 2 games, because remember they had a bye in week 10. He was expected to have scored 36 fantasy points based on his passes, his targets, where they've been on the field, and how many he's converted. But he's only scored 24. So he is certainly an underperformer. Despite scoring that touchdown last week, even though he scored 18.6 fantasy points, he is expected to have scored more over the past couple of weeks. So Elijah Moore stays an underperforming wide receiver for the showdown slate. We'd love to see that. He is, 6,400 on DraftKings. So, and then his teammate, Cedric Tillman, who did not join the party last week with Jerry Jeudy and Elijah, only 7.7 fantasy points last week. He's expected to have scored 35 over the last 2 games. He's only scored 28. So Cedric Tillman, 2 underperforming wide receivers to pair along with Jameis Winston for tonight's slate. Now, we don't technically have underperforming running backs. I've talked about this before in these showdown videos. But if you look at expected fantasy points versus actual fantasy points, you can get some guys that have a chance to regress towards the mean. And both these starting running backs, both these lead running backs for tonight's game are technically underperforming. It's Najee Harris and Nick Chubb. Now, Najee has scored 14 less fantasy points than he should have so far this year. Nick Chubb, despite only playing a few weeks, has scored 19 less fantasy points. His is much more of a striking difference considering how many fewer games he's played than Najee Harris. Now, unlike underperforming wide receivers, this isn't a tried and true method to automatically performing the next week. And again, underperforming wide receivers aren't that either, right? But underperforming wide receivers are much more predictive than these running backs who are underperforming, right? Because we could have guys like these guys could regress to the mean like Rashad White and Breece Hall, who were underperforming to start the season and then have multi-touchdown games, or they could be like Javonte Williams and Ramondre Stevenson and just never regress, right? And there are a variety of factors why this may be the case, but Najee and Chubb, at least on a showdown slate, when we're looking for reasons to play guys, we're looking for reasons to get leverage on players, looking for reasons to play guys at captain or MVP. This is a pretty good reason to do it. Now, the best reason, when you combine this, is Nick Chubb is going to be astronomically low owned on this slate because he hasn't performed. 6 fantasy points per game. His projections across the industry are not great, and he's $9,000 on DraftKings for some reason. On FanDuel, he'll be a little higher owned at $11,500. But his projection still isn't good. He'll be less than 20% here. He could be near 10% and maybe even lower in smaller contests on DraftKings. So underperforming plus Nick Chubb. Yes, he's coming off the knee injury, but I've seen some tape and some film breakdowns that show he looks pretty decent and is due for a big game. So we like that. And that will lead us even more into the high risk section. So stay around for that. Hydration before the low risk section. Who would have thought? Now, I guess let's talk about the weather, and then we'll talk about strategy here. Because you look at tonight's game, the total is actually held pretty steady. Let's go to our live odds feed at occupyfantasy.com. This is free, by the way. Total opened at 36.5. It's at 37. It's basically held at 37 all week. Generally, when I'm looking for weather to make a huge impact, the night before, overnight, we see a drop in the line. If we see this line drop throughout the day to 36, 35, we'll know that the weather has a higher chance of being more impactful in tonight's game. But it's also a decent chance that this weather was well known when this line was released. We have likely rain and maybe snow pretty consistently throughout the game. Wind gusts 15 to 25 miles per hour relatively consistently throughout the game. Obviously, it impacts the Cleveland Stadium a little more than most stadiums. So we could see a run-heavy approach tonight. We could see a lower-scoring game. Again, that's reflected in the line, and it's probably reflected in most projections. But how we build lineups, the field won't be hip to that if we believe that the weather will impact tonight's game. So we'll talk about that in the high-risk section. But if we talk about low-risk, and we think the total is reflective of what this game will do tonight. And if we believe that the weather won't have that great of an impact on tonight's game, this is how we would build low-risk lineups for tonight. We try to fit in both quarterbacks and both running backs if it makes sense. Let's go to DraftKings, right? And we play Russell Wilson. Let's put him in the captain spot. Russell Wilson, Najee Harris, Jameis Winston. Now here's where, do you want to play the 9K Nick Chubb? Again, he's underperforming and low-owned, not the best low-risk play. We could play his backfield mate, who's much cheaper and going to see about half the work anyways, than Jerome Ford. And then we could play either Calvin Austin, who is underpriced at $2,000 as a receiver, and then you could play Nick Chubb still. That's interesting. Or you could go 2 mid-range players. Steelers defense should be popular on this slate at $5,400. Somehow they're still cheaper than the Texans defense from Monday night, despite being in a better spot and it being an overall better defense. And then you could play underperforming wide receiver Elijah Moore. You could play around with it. But I think the core 4 is Wilson, Harris, Winston, and probably Jerome Ford. But if you like Chubb, you can fit him in. You can fit him in tonight. You can go that route as well. Now on FanDuel, I think there's 2 ways to go, and it's pretty similar. And you play Najee. You could play Chubb here, and then you could punt with the 6K option, which there aren't really that many great 6K or lower options tonight that are even going to see the field, so I probably wouldn't go this way. You can play Ford, who is 8K here, and then you could probably play Steelers defense or Jalen Warren or a kicker, whoever you feel here. That's probably the way to go. Now, you're going to build differently if you believe that the weather is an impact. So this is what we'll do here. I'm going to bring this up. I showed this on a video last year, and these are trends that when a game goes under the total or scores a certain amount of points, how optimal lineups are built. Before I show you though, let's think about the highest owned captains and MVPs on both sites. On DraftKings, it's going to be probably who you expect: Russell Wilson, George Pickens, Najee Harris, Cedric Tillman, underpriced at 7K, and then Jameis Winston. Those will be the guys who are high owned, in addition to Najee Harris. So those will be those popular plays. And on FanDuel, it's going to be the quarterbacks, Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston as the most popular, and then Najee will fill in as probably the third most popular MVP on FanDuel tonight. So we can take advantage of that if we choose to build how the weather is telling us. So let's check out these trends I put together last year, and they still apply it for this year. So I'm going to show you like 5 or 6 slides here, and feel free to pause the video, take some notes as you look at these. So these are looking at games over the past 5 years for showdown slates that where the final score, you see where it says total points less than 38? This is the final score, not the pregame total. So tonight's pregame total is 37. That doesn't necessarily qualify it for this, but if this game scores 37 points or less, then it qualifies. If it scores 31 points or less or 30 points or less, then it qualifies here. So how to read this is if you look at all games over the past 5 years for FanDuel and DraftKings, the average winning lineup has used 49.1K on DraftKings, 58.1K on FanDuel. Maybe that's lower than you probably thought. However, once the final score of a game is 37 points or less, these totals drop. It goes from 49.1 on DraftKings to 47.9, and on FanDuel it drops a little bit, $400. If the total drops to 30 points or less, these teams, the final score is 17-10, right? That drops $1,800 compared to the average and $2,000 on FanDuel compared to the average. So if you believe that this game scores 37 points or less tonight, main takeaway, you should be using less salary. If you think it scores even less, you should be using even less salary. So number one takeaway, use less salary for tonight, unless you believe that the game goes over the total. Now, we've had situations like this in the past. In fact, I think it was a Cleveland game against Baltimore. I came on this video, talked about how we should probably play for a lower scoring game. I think they legitimately scored like 70 points in that game. Obviously, it didn't work and we lost that night. However, there was the Buffalo game against New England, an obvious win game. Our members crushed that night because we told them to build for a low scoring game. The final score was like 13-10, and we had a huge night. I mean, you could also just look at my $1 million winning lineup where I played for a lower scoring game. Obviously, that wasn't weather related, but when the final's 13-3, that left $2,200 left over in a solo win. So we know if we're going to play for a low scoring game, and this is what I'm advocating for. This is what I will play in my lineups tonight. I'm playing for a lower scoring game. I'm playing that the weather plays an impact, and even if it doesn't, these two teams could just go under the total. I'm leaving less salary. I'm leaving more salary on the table for tonight. All right, next slide. When the games score 38 or less or 31 or less, how many quarterbacks are used? How many times are 0 quarterbacks used in a lineup? Typically, in a regular game, just 10% of the time on DraftKings are there zero quarterbacks. So 90% of the time, there's at least one quarterback in the winning lineup. FanDuel, that number is 14%. Once the total drops 37 points or less, once the team score 37 points or less in a game, that jumps up to 19% 0 quarterback on DraftKings, 16%. Not a big difference on FanDuel. The biggest difference is when we get to 31 points or less, right? This game, again, scores, it's 16-13, it's 16-10. That jumps up to 25% for DraftKings, 36% for FanDuel. So if you think this game is much lower scoring, especially on DraftKings, feel free to use more 0 quarterback lineups. And again, it's not a huge number, right? It's still only 1 out of every 4 winning lineups on DraftKings use 0 quarterbacks when the total is 30 or less. Not a big number, but when you consider the field is never going to do that really, that's where you get the leverage. All right, next. Defense usage. DraftKings, and maybe this is a surprising number too. All games, 36% of DraftKings winning lineups have one defense. FanDuel is roughly the same, 38%. Look at this jump. 37 points or less, that jumps to 60% on DraftKings. 52% on FanDuel, a 24 and a 14% jump. Look what happens when it goes to 30 or less. 77% of the time, 82% of the time. Basically, if it's 30 or less, a defense is in the lineup. So if you're playing for a lower scoring game, play a defense in your lineup tonight. And again, despite what we think, this is generally just one defense, not necessarily both defenses. Still very rarely do we get both defenses in a lineup. in a winning lineup. So stick to one, probably one in all lineups if you're playing for a lower scoring game tonight. Now, this is a little bit of a chaotic chart here. Let's try to follow it. The top line in the yellow is the percent that each position had an optimal captain. This is a DraftKings chart. So 18% of the time, quarterback's in the optimal captain, 29% running back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this next row, these next two rows are when the total is 37 or less, and the next is 30 or less. So not massive differences here as far as like, especially when you compare it to defense, right? And we see a 24 and a 41% jump. We're just seeing single digit jumps here. The most consistent winners of lower scoring games are wide receivers. 3% bump, 37 or less, 2% bump, 30 or less. Running backs get the bump here. Defenses obviously get the most consistent bump, 13%, 5%, and 8%. But it can flip-flop on quarterback and running back. So play quarterback and running back as you normally would. And if you're considering a super low-scoring game, consider playing wide receivers and defenses at captain more heavily. FanDuel is where we get honestly the biggest differences here, right? Once we have lower total games, 37-30, the optimal MVP for quarterbacks drops by 13% and 24%. Now you pair that with tonight when both quarterbacks are going to be the highest owned MVPs on the slate. We have a recipe for extreme leverage if this data holds true and the game actually goes under the total. So we really like seeing that when the field is doing the opposite of what the data suggests. So we love that tonight. And if quarterbacks are being optimal less often, who gets the benefit? It's running backs and it's wide receivers, shockingly, which you may not expect, right? Kickers even get a little bit of a bump. Tight ends go down, but it's really running backs and receivers on FanDuel tonight is where you should be looking for MVP if you're playing for a lower scoring game. And wide receivers sounds crazy, but look at this. This is a screenshot from Jack a couple of years ago, creator of our lineup builder, if you're not familiar. This was not anticipated to be a lower scoring game, at least not in the 25-point range. This game finished 25-0, an absolute barn burner between New England and Atlanta. But Jack used Nelson Aguilar at MVP as a wide receiver, who you would never use in a higher scoring game probably. So, yeah, it works. So make sure you pause it, look at all this stuff, look at all this data, take notes. Key takeaways here. Let's go back to DraftKings. And again, this is what I'm advocating for. They could score 40, 50, 60 points tonight, and we could be very wrong. Very possible. It's happened before. It will happen again in the future. But we know when we compare it to what the field is doing, there is a massive edge here. And if the game goes under the total, we would build more properly than the field would build. So the takeaways, leave more salary on the table. Probably use at least one defense in every lineup if you believe it's low scoring. Play more running backs and wide receivers at captain and MVP, especially on FanDuel. And be willing to use more zero quarterback lineups. Again, that is not a guarantee. They just hit more often in these types of games than they do typically. So if you're building, 20 plus lineups, 150 plus lineups, allow zero quarterback lineups. I wouldn't necessarily force all zero quarterback lineups, or if I'm hand building, I wouldn't necessarily force it, but it does happen. Allow it. So yeah, if this game goes under the total, again, the weather looks pretty decently bad, we have a pretty big chance at winning a lot of tickets, a lot of contests tonight if we build properly for this type of game environment. Now, I know this is a unique type of game. We don't see this very often, but we will see it more often in November, December, and even January. So if you have questions about it, drop a comment on the video below. I will happily answer it. Don't ask any 1v1, should I play this guy or this guy? If you have any high-level questions about this type of strategy, drop it below the video. I will answer it before the slate starts tonight. Discord is a better way. We'll have probably some in-depth conversations throughout the day on our Discord server about this game and how to approach it. So keep that in mind. The link is in the description below to join that. And then in addition, our daily plug, which will go more in-depth on how to approach tonight's game, that'll be up this afternoon, occupyfantasy.com. And our model and our lineup builder with projected ownership and our rankings is already up and running, and that'll be updated throughout the day as well. If you're not already, make sure you subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. Free to do so. Helps us out. Let you know when we post these videos every single week. And give us a thumbs up if you like the video. That'll do it. Brian Jester for Occupy Fantasy. Appreciate you listening as always, and good luck. And try to enjoy tonight's 37-point total between the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers.